All right, I think now's probably good a time as any. Hi, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well today. My name's Allie. I'm the admin assistant for the Columbine Health Systems Center for Healthy Aging. Just wanted to again say, if you didn't hear my first note, please mute your mics. And if you have any questions, just pop them in the chat. All right, and now it's my great honor to introduce Tom LaRocca. He joined the Department of Health and Exercise Science and the Center for Healthy Aging at CSU in the summer of 2019. His background is in molecular biology and physiology, and he is very interested in translational research, that is, using multiple approaches and models in the laboratory to develop practical applications or therapies for people. Tom's research focuses on understanding the biology of Healthspan, the period of life during which we are healthy and productive, and he has studied cellular changes that occur in the heart and arteries as we age. He's also studied the biology of neurodegenerative diseases like ALS and Alzheimer's using computational approaches. Tom's a former high school chemistry teacher and college writing instructor, and he enjoys bringing his interest into the classroom. All right, Tom, whenever you're ready, let's begin.
Just making sure my mic is on now. It looks like it is. And I hope everybody can see this. Allie, maybe you can tell me if there are any audio issues or video too. So
so far.
Looks good. Great. So thanks, Allie. That was great. Thanks to everybody for being here, and a big thanks to Nicole for making these events happen in this strange time. So like Allie said, I'm a new assistant professor here in health and exercise science. And I named my new lab the Healthspan Biology Lab. And that's because Healthspan is very important to me. I think I was actually interested in the idea before I even knew what it was. I'm in my 40s now and I have 2 little kids who tire me out. But back in college when I had more energy, I used to compete in triathlons. And honestly, I was never really any good, but it was fun. And at every race, I'd always see people like this. Jim, the old bullet here. So guys and gals in their 70s and even 80s competing in these extreme endurance events. And I remember thinking, that is so cool. How can I be like that when I grow up? And that idea became a little more personal for me years later when my parents started to age, and honestly, not very well. My mom developed cancer and battled that for about a decade. My dad took on the stressful role of caregiver, and that really impacted his health. And when she passed, he declined even faster and eventually died of neurodegenerative disease. And that all happened way too early in life for them, but I think that it's an increasingly common kind of story. And I've always thought that if they could have had just a little more of that old bullet in them, that maybe things might have been a little bit different. And it's a little funny because about the same time I was in graduate school, and I was learning that there are funding agencies and institutes that actually support research on aging. And they have a biomedical narrative with specific vocabulary to describe the thoughts that I'd been having. And most of them will tell you a similar story. It goes something like this. We know that aging is a problem because our world is aging. So these are countries today with a high percentage of older adults, and this is the world in the near future, just a few decades from now. So a major change. And this is a problem because as we age, we're more and more likely to develop diseases of aging. In fact, many of these things occur together, so people call them comorbidities of aging. And the problem is that if you add diseases of aging to an aging population, it adds up to some kind of catastrophe. And people are giving this clever names like the silver tsunami, which of course refers to the color of George Clooney's hair, not the shape, in case you're wondering. But all joking aside, this is a real problem. It's very serious. People are talking about things like Medicare going bankrupt and shortages of healthcare workers. So real doomsday kind of stuff. And I also like to point out that this is not just about old people. George here is a baby boomer and his generation is driving this change, but he's not old and they're not old. And if you think about it, most of us listening today, millennials included, would probably be in the orange in a few decades. So it's a problem for all of us, and it's a big problem, speaking of millennials here. The question is, what do we do? So one potential idea is that maybe we need to focus on increasing health span. In case you haven't heard of this concept, the idea is that if you think of your life from birth to death, it's obvious that there's a period of time during which we're healthy and productive, even if things are starting to slow down. That eventually gives way to those diseases of aging and death, of course. But the healthy period is our health span. And what we'd like to do is not necessarily live longer, but live longer in better health, increase our health span. And the idea is that that would mean less time in the red zone here, which would be better for everybody individually. And it would also reduce the potential public health crisis. So I think it's a neat idea. The question is, how do we actually do that? And what I wanted to do today was just to share a few ideas with you on how we do research on that topic. So 3 ideas to start. The first is that it helps if we can focus on function. And by this, I'm referring to physiological function, all the many things our bodies do. There's actually really good data showing that all of our major physiological functions start to decline in our 30s. It's a total bummer, I know. I'm sorry to have to tell you that on the lunch hour during social isolation, but it's true. Our heart and arteries become less efficient, our metabolisms decline, our brains actually become a little less quick starting in our 30s. And it's totally normal, it happens to all of us. But the problem is that as those functions decline, the risk of corresponding diseases increases. So as our metabolisms decline, we're at a greater risk for diabetes. As our brain function declines, we're at a greater risk for neurodegeneration like Alzheimer's disease. So the point is that we can't just focus on treating those diseases at the end of life. We also need to try to prevent that decline that happens in our 30s, 40s, and 50s. And what we really want to do is to push back the functional decline. And you can see that this is actually kind of analogous to changing the shape of the health span curve here. I think it's also intuitive. Most of us would love to live like this in our 90s. But that brings me to my second idea and point, which is that when we're focusing on function, it helps if we can do translational science. And that's because a very logical question would be, what happens between here and here? And at the biological level anyway, the answer is many things. Most of them are bad. And we call them the hallmarks of aging. You don't need to know what all of these things are, but you might recognize terms like free radicals or inflammation. The main point here is that they're all cellular events, and you can't always study them directly in humans. So it helps if you can be flexible and use different laboratory approaches or models. For example, some of my colleagues and I, we use computational approaches to study genetic factors that might influence inflammation or cognitive function in people. But then we'll go back to the lab sometimes and maybe study those same factors in neurons that we grow in a dish to try to figure out how they work, or perhaps test treatments that might improve health span by targeting those factors in a small nematode worm called C. elegans. And if you joined us last time, you know that there are multiple translational models like the dog, the mouse, and others. And the main point, though, is that in all of this, the primary goal is to learn something using these models that we can translate back up to improve health in people. And I think this is a fun thing to do. It's kind of exciting. I will say that it's very challenging. It often always requires teamwork and collaboration. And I'll also mention that it helps when you're doing this if you have a lens. And that's because if you look at these hallmarks of aging, you'll notice that they're very complicated. There's kind of a lot going on down here. So a good question is, how can you focus your research and try to figure out where to focus your efforts? One way to do that is to ask another logical question, which is, what do we know increases health span? And there are a couple of semi-obvious answers like healthy diet and exercise. These tend to reverse the hallmarks of aging. So we can ask questions like, how exactly does exercise reduce inflammation? And if we can figure that out, then we might be able to learn what kind of exercise is best, or are there diets or foods that might achieve the same effects? Or maybe even could we design a pharmaceutical that might target those same beneficial pathways? I think this is a neat idea. You can use it in multiple ways. I'll just give you a couple of examples here. Take, for instance, gray hair. So this is something that will happen to most of us when we age. And there's some interesting biology behind it. But if you look at older adults who exercise routinely, you find that they get gray hair too. And so while it's not perfect, it suggests at least that the gray hair isn't the cause of problems. In contrast, And this is an example of research from my lab. We used computational biology to study DNA and RNA, and we can detect how thousands of genes increase or decrease with something like aging. You don't need to understand these graphs at all. The point I want to make is that on the left is a comparison of older versus younger adults. And you can see that there are several thousand genes, these little red data points that increase up here or decrease down here with that comparison. But on the right is the same comparison, but we're comparing older exercising adults to those same younger adults. And you can see that many of those red data points disappear. And what that suggests, at least, is that those particular genes might be worth studying. And this is definitely a geeky biology example, but I should emphasize that aging is a multifaceted problem, and we need to study it from multiple perspectives: social, psychological, economic, and others. And I think that this lens concept works in those contexts as well. So here's an interesting example, I think. In case you don't know, there are populations around the world in which many people live past the age of 100. People call these blue zones. And so just like with exercise or diet, we can use this observation as a lens and ask, what are the common socio-economic characteristics of these populations? And there are fascinating books on this that I encourage you to read. I'll just tell you now that much of the data point to non-biological factors like positive outlook and strong social support networks. But anyway, it seems to me that if we can combine approaches like this with translational science and a focus on function, then at least in our research, we can really go a long way towards increasing health span, hopefully. In the last few minutes here, though, I'd like to just share one other idea with you that I think is important. It's less about science and research and more about engagement. So in case you don't know, you probably do, there's a lot of, let's just say, variable information out there on aging. And this is not about pointing fingers or anything, but rather about what I think is our responsibility as the biomedical community to highlight what we know as the truth and to try to make it accessible for people. So I think it's important that we focus on communicating evidence-based information. There are some great examples out there in which researchers, clinicians, and public health professionals have gotten together to review all of the evidence that we have on important topics and develop highly recognizable guidelines for how we should do things. Maybe the best example is USDA's MyPlate, which is, again, a recognizable set of guidelines for how we should eat. And it's based on the best scientific data that we have. Another example would be the American Heart Association's guidelines for blood pressure and cholesterol levels. And if you need a non-science or health example, the city of Fort Collins has some clear guidelines for what we can or cannot recycle. But nobody's ever really done this for healthy aging, and I think it would be great if there were a simple, recognizable checklist for how to do it well, based on the best information that we have. And we do actually have good information, but many people just don't know about it. For example, did you know that the recommended dietary intake of salt on a daily basis is 2,300 milligrams, or about a teaspoon, but that the average American actually consumes much more than that, 3,400 milligrams? And that this is actually a problem in the context of aging. The American Heart Association recommends that past the age of 51, we actually consume even less salt to maximally reduce our risks of heart attack and stroke. Or here's another example. There's actually very good data, you may not know this, but good data showing that in our 50s and 60s, we should be able to ideally stand on one foot unsupported for more than 20 seconds. And in fact, the American College of Sports Medicine recommends that to support that goal, we engage in balance activities 2 days per week. We can all turn our cameras on later and try this together if you'd like. But the point is that these are just a few examples of information on aging that I think is not widely known. And I think it would be really fantastic if we could get the right people, the right brains and experts around the table to review all of that information, to vet it and organize it, and maybe come up with a checklist and a campaign, perhaps sort of a roadmap for healthy aging, because I think this would go a long way to increasing health span broadly. And that's a big idea, of course, but back to my original point, I think in the meantime, we can at least focus on communicating the evidence-based information that we do have. And in case you don't know, that's something we're working on here at the center. I encourage you to check out the new website if you haven't done so already. It's very early in development, but it represents a lot of work that my colleagues and I have done to start establishing a way to share evidence-based information on aging. We're hoping that it can be a platform for advancing this kind of thing in the future. I think it's very important work, and I'll say again that if we can combine that with some of those ideas about how we do research on Healthspan, that maybe we can make a big difference in this for real people. And I hope you agree with me. Thanks.
All right. If anyone has any questions, feel free to still put them in the chat. We have one to start out with. So Tom, what do you think is the nearest term intervention pharmacological that is likely to make it to mainstream use in humans to support healthy longevity?
That's a great question. I'm not sure, but in case people don't know, there is a lot of interest in a pharmacological agent known as metformin. And so metformin has a history of being used as an anti-diabetic agent for decades. And there's actually a number of groups around the country who are working on doing a large multi-site trial to try to determine if metformin is actually a bona fide anti-aging compound or anti-aging agent that we could prescribe broadly to people. It's challenging, and this is, I think, relevant to anything that could potentially be an anti-aging drug or treatment, because currently the FDA does not recognize aging as a treatable condition. And so you can't actually use something like metformin for that purpose yet. But the goal with this trial is to get there and to get the FDA to recognize that and allow that kind of thing in the future.
Any other questions? What do you think we can do as a university to engage our community, even the students involved in healthy aging?
Well, I think we can do events like this as often as possible. I really love the idea of ramping up our communications. I think there's a lot of, especially in these times, right? People are very interested in sources of information that are reliable, and we're not all able to get out of the house all the time now. So I imagine people are reading things on the internet and other sources much more. So I think it would be great if we could scale up our efforts to make the website really enjoyable to read, get people sort of interested in the topic. And I think for students especially, it's important to try to tell the story in a way similarly, hopefully, to what I just did, to emphasize that this is something that's not just about people at the later ends of the lifespan. It really is, it's a whole lifespan thing, and we need to focus on maximizing our health throughout the lifespan so that we have better chances of living longer in better health later in life.
What sort of things other than diet and exercise would you add to the healthy aging checklist?
Great question. So there's a lot of interest. Again, I think the Blue Zone story is very interesting, and people should check that out. So there are lots of alternative or complementary approaches that you might think of them that way. Things like meditation, stress reduction activities. There's great evidence for keeping your brain engaged and being active in that context as well.
Are you currently working with Larimer County Health District at all? They also emphasize education.
I am not, but and as far as I know, we are not. But that could be a great way to connect with more people.
Oops, I was muted. Are there any interesting observations about how much of the benefit of living in a blue zone can be acquired by moving there by a certain age, or must one be born in the environment?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I'm not aware of data on that. The thought is, so when people, and I'm not a blue zone expert either, I should say, but my understanding is that when people identify these places, the first thought was that they would go there and take biological samples from people and find that there was some interesting kind of common genetic factors and that maybe people who lived there, had almost sort of evolved a little bit, or there was something going on at the biological level that could explain their increased longevity. But they basically didn't find anything like that. And what's shaken out is that what seems to be the most common characteristics of those populations are these just behaviors, really lifestyle behaviors. And it doesn't seem to have anything to do with the actual location. There's no real common thread to the geographical locations. Some of them are at sea level, some of them are in more mountainous regions. And I think what that really tells you is that you can learn from the behaviors and the things that people are doing in those places and do that anywhere. So it probably doesn't require moving to those blue zones.
For exercise, are there any specific things that show promise?
I think any kind of exercise is great exercise, and there's great data showing that it doesn't have to be intense exercise. It doesn't have to be super long duration, and it doesn't have to be very high intensity. Just getting out and doing brisk walking is great. There's certainly a lot of interest these days in, I think, what people sort of think about as being more time efficient alternatives to sort of traditional exercise. So a lot of interest in high intensity interval training. That's challenging because as we get older, we may or may not be able to exercise at those high intensities, and there can be some danger there. So have to be careful when you think about those kinds of things. But there's even interest in sort of, again, I guess alternative forms of exercise. There are some folks who are investigating basically training the strength of your lung muscles. So perhaps you don't even have to get out and breathe hard while you're running, but you might be able to breathe into an apparatus that has a lot of resistance to it, and that stresses your lung muscles, which increases, or basically puts a stress on the same systems that exercise would stress, and that might have some of the same benefits. And I should say that most of that work is very, very early, so it's nothing that you could recommend. I'll just go back to my original point that any kind of exercise at all, even moderate exercise, goes a long way.
For the balancing information that you mentioned, do you think, how do you think that's associated with the health outcomes? Do you think it's to do with the nervous system or the musculoskeletal system?
Yeah, so I guess the question is, what is the cause of that? And that's not honestly my area of expertise. I'd say the goal with those recommendations from the ACSM and other organizations is to reduce the risk of disability. And so, as we age, as our balance and coordinations and other similar functions decline a little bit, we're more likely to fall and become injured. I would recommend anybody who's interested in that actually check out the American College for Sports Medicine website. They have very specific guidelines for different age groups.
Right. And, one participant said that they were in a gym that had an over 50s class, but they recognized that many of the exercises were inappropriate for the older participants, so they quit. Would you consider offering your information and expertise to health clubs?
Yeah, that's something that a couple of us at the center have actually, that it's come up in conversations here and there, sort of recently actually, that it might be interesting to connect with local gyms and health clubs and really try to use that as an avenue for getting the word out, and just increasing awareness of aging in general and the things that we can do. So that's a great idea.
What are your top 3 tips that would be valuable to educate patients on ways to incorporate healthy aging tips into a daily routine?
Yeah, healthy aging tips into a daily routine. I think, I personally don't do, there's all sorts of supplements and things out there. And I think that some of them are backed by more evidence than others. I just try to, I think my one tip that I've read most of the Blue Zones books, and I've enjoyed most of them. And I think based on the evidence that I've seen and all of the research sort of circles that I've been in, the one tip that I can say I think kind of encompasses much of the discussion is to focus on moderation. And so, moderation in diet, and even moderation in activity, but being active, I guess, not being extremely active. You just need to get out there and be active to some extent. Eating a diet that's not too high in any one thing or too low in any one thing. I don't think there's any particular correct diet. There's a lot of literature on those things as well. And then, I think you could interpret moderation as including things like just your general lifestyle behaviors and not going to any extremes. So there's a great evidence for just sleep and stress, so good sleep and low stress contributing to healthy aging. And so if you can incorporate those things into your life, I think that goes a long way.
All right. You mentioned several health aspects such as metabolic and vascular health. I wonder if there is anything you'd like to say about the intersection of aging and health with how pandemic affects our health from your perspective.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'm actually working with some folks that are very interested in the whole COVID-19 thing and the question of why does it seem to affect older folks more than younger, which is and not the very young, which is very different from influenza, for example. So I think there's a lot of interest in this. The National Institute on Aging has lots of funding opportunity and announcements out there right now, trying to get people to do research on this and figure it out. From my perspective right now, I suspect that it has something to do with that susceptibility of the older folks, has something to do with what we know happens at the biological level, that's kind of connected to some of those hallmarks of aging I mentioned. So there are changes in the immune system, there are changes in molecular pathways that are that the immune system relies on, like degrading proteins and things like that. And it might be degrading proteins that come from viruses, but nobody knows the answer to this question right now. There's a lot of speculation, but there are certainly people who are trying to figure it out. I guess more practically right now, I think I know that I don't get the same number of steps that I was getting just a few months ago on a daily basis. And I think that the lifestyle behaviors that we can try to control right now are sort of the best thing that we can do, just to support our own healthy aging, independent of whether COVID-19 is in the picture or not. I think I'm trying to stay active, trying to get good sleep. And for me, that means not obsessing over whatever the latest news on the virus is.
Do you see any role for intermittent fasting in healthy aging?
I do. I think this is a very promising area of research. It's not something that I personally or my lab has investigated. We've talked about it. I think that the field is not quite there yet, but I would say that most people who are studying, the experts who are studying intermittent fasting, would tell you that they think at some point there may be things that we can recommend in that context, or strategies that we can recommend, because it does seem very promising and it makes a lot of sense on a biological level. The caveat that I think is important is that with any of the fasting approaches, we need to be very careful in the context of aging. And so we know that as we age, for example, we tend to lose muscle mass past the age of 50, especially every year there's a specific decline in muscle mass. And that's one of the things that contributes to the increased risk for falls and disabilities and just general reductions in quality of life. And so you can imagine that if you did too much of any kind of fasting regime and we're not getting enough of the proper nutrients or enough protein to maintain muscle mass, that could be a problem. And so I think people are very aware of this and thinking about it, but it does seem like there's something promising going on with intermittent fasting.
Could you go back to the slide with the 2 red dots on genetics, and the slide with the 2 red dots and genetics, and why the 2 slides were so different?
Oh, many red dots, right? Yeah. I guess I could try to pull that up and try to explain why they're so different. Where are we? So this is the one. And the comparison here, so on the left, and this is very, it's complicated. And so again, like I said, it's not, you almost don't really need to understand all of the details here. The key point is that the comparison on the left here is just older adults versus younger adults. And the comparison on the right is older habitually exercising adults versus the same younger adults. And the observation is that and I should say every one of these little data points represents a gene that is either turned on more if it's going in the upward direction here, or turned off more if it's going in the downward direction here. So the data points that are statistically significant are red, and those that are not statistically significant are gray here. And you can see that there are many fewer statistically significant genes over here. And this is why are there so, I think the question is basically, why are there so many over here and so few over here? And there's several answers to that. One, from a sort of biological perspective, is that exercise, these are folks, I should say, in this study that we did, these are folks who have been exercising at least 45 minutes a day for 5 days a week for the past 10 years of their life. So these are people who exercise a lot. And so that's a very powerful biological and physiological stimulus. And you can imagine that that would be associated with lots of changes in how genes are turned on and off. And I should also make the point that we're not saying that these people, their genes are different. These graphs are actually showing whether those genes are turned on or off. So there's no major genetic differences, but just differences in how the genes are being expressed is what we say. And then the other thing I would tell you is that just whenever you do these, we're looking at 20,000 things at the same time, there's going to be lots of variability. And so, it may be that the real number of genes that are differentially turned on or off between these two graphs is smaller than what we see here, but this is a compelling example to use for a presentation, I think. And then the last thing I would say too is that, and this may be sort of encouraging for those of us who are non-exercisers, is that if you look closely at the two graphs, what you notice is that even the red genes here and some of these gray genes here, the distance that they're up or down is actually not that different. It just so happens that some of them, when we do our statistical analyses on these, are statistically significantly different over here. And it may be that this red data point over here is kind of only down here, and so it just didn't get flagged as statistically significant. But back to my original point, I do think that this, to some extent, is real because, again, exercise is such a powerful stimulus.
You stated that there are several factors that impact our health, like genetics, accidents, diet, exposure to harmful things like passive smoke, etc. Do you see a future possibility for being able to assess on a personal level the factors and use that to inform or design an optimal plan?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think people are very interested in this and the idea of being able to test people for a panel of biomarkers and learn if there's something, or determine if there's something, some prescription basically that could be associated or linked with, certain expressions or phenotypes within those biomarkers. People call it prescription medicine. And historically, prescription medicine, people have really thought about that in the context of cancer, and that if we can identify the particular mutation that you have that is driving a cancer, for example, then maybe we can identify the right drug or treatment to treat that cancer, and it would be much more effective. But there's interest in this in the context of aging as well. So if we know the right things to look at, whether they're genes or lifestyle behaviors and exposures, smoke, things like that, then you could, presumably and in theory, decades from now, maybe all of us will go to the doctor and get a panel of those things run, and then there'll be a computer algorithm that develops a prescription for what we should do, or what supplements we should take, or maybe what drugs we should take if the FDA has approved that kind of thing by then.
Did I miss anybody? All right. Well, if there's no further questions, I will invite everybody to come to our next talk. It will be June 18th, same time, still on Zoom. That'll be with Lisa Morgan, and her talk will be Connect, Collaborate, Thrive, Moving Through Parkinson's. I'll drop my email in the chat if anybody isn't on the list yet that needs to be added to our mailing list. And or if anybody has any questions that they want to follow up with me later.